Oh, beloved, we'll be getting started shortly. I'm trying to call someone in. Hi, I'm just starting the service, so, okay. All right. Good afternoon, beloved. Welcome to Shiloh Community Church Online Edition. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for the opportunity to be here this morning. Thank you for everyone who's here, everyone who's on their way, everyone who's linking up, Lord. Thank you for the technology to virtually connect together, Lord. I ask that you be with the families of everyone who's in isolation, Lord, everyone who's ill, everyone who's lost loved ones, Lord. Keep hearing of more and more people we know and people we don't know who have lost loved ones, Lord. And we ask you to be in the midst of that, to comfort the families and let this situation draw people closer to you. Lord, in Jesus' name we pray, amen. We're in a difficult time now. We're going to sing Amazing Grace. So if you would like to sing along with me, please sing along with me. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. Was grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieve. How precious did that grace appear, the hour I first believed. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've known less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. Amen. Before we get into the word of the Lord for today, we're continuing our march through the Bible. After Job comes Psalms, which is very appropriate for the circumstances and the situation that we're in. Our God is always an on-time God. I do want to mention that if you care to share tithes and offerings, they can be mailed to 1 Liberty Street in Bath. We still are moving forward with the ministry that we're doing. We're hoping that the lockdown will end enough to have the electricity done at the Decademy House shortly. So anybody who feels moved to do that, if the Lord needs you to do that, please participate. Okay. So now God's word for God's people. As we continue through the Bible, as I said, our God, who's always an on-time God, has us in the book of Psalms, which comes immediately after Job. Excuse me. We're going to be focusing on Psalms 23 today. But first, I'd like to give you a little overview of the book of Psalms. We could not possibly cover the entire book in one Sunday. There are 150 Psalms. So I urge you to read them on your own. We will have an overview of the book and then a focus on 23. The book of Psalms is the first book in the third section of the Old Testament, which some scholars divide up into sections. So it's referred to as the writings. It's not a historical narrative of people, which is how Genesis starts, with giving us a history of the people of Israel, the Jewish faith, and therefore the Christian faith and the Islamic faith. We are all people of the Old Testament book. And so the historical focus is the first part of the Bible. And then in the next section, there are biographies of individual lives. There's Esther, there's Job, there's biographies of individual lives, Ruth. So we get to see how God's people lived on sort of a smaller micro level, as opposed to the overview of the lives of the people of God in the first part. And then Psalm starts the writings, they're called. So they're not stories of a people or of individual people, but they begin timeless writings which are instructive in and of themselves, no matter what time you're living in. So the word Psalms comes from the Greek word psalmoi, meaning instrumental music, and by extension, the words that are sung with the instrumental music. If the books were written, the books in the Psalms were written by King David. Some modern scholars like to dispute that, but some modern scholars like to dispute everything in the Bible. The Bible clearly says the Psalms are written by David and they're songs of David. And I want you to remember that one of David's jobs in the palace before he became king, when Saul was king, was to play music to soothe the king. So there's no reason to think that he couldn't write songs and music as he did in the book of Psalms, because that was his job for the king. So it's perfectly sensible that he wrote these. The first musical notations in Western music were invented or introduced by a guy named Guido of Arezzo in 991 AD. There were earlier Middle Eastern and Asian and other forms of musical notation, but scholars don't agree on what they mean. And so we don't know what the music was that these psalms were sung to. We know that they were likely sung to music because that's what they're called, but we don't know what they sounded like. The words, however, are still very powerful as you go through them. And with the pandemic and shutdown and daily death toll, the idea that death is a constant theme now in our lives. We all truly live in the valley of the shadow of death. And we should take a look at what the Bible says about the valley of the shadow of death. And the 23rd Psalm addresses that and reads as follows in King James Version. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. So for now, let's zero in on verse 4 of Psalm 23. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. The Bible tells us not to fear evil, but there is definitely evil in the valleys of our lives. And we're going to discuss the following points. What does it mean to walk through the valley of the shadow of death? Who is there in the valley of the shadow of death? Who should be afraid in the valley of the shadow of death? And how do we cope as we walk through the valley of the shadow of death? Let's start with walking. When we walk, we make a choice. Someone may hold a gun on us to make us walk, which we would certainly be walking in the shadow of death at that point. And they could demand that we walk, but we could choose not to. They may shoot us, but we still have a choice, right? So when we walk, we have volunteered to move, to go. Thus, walking is always a voluntary physical action. The walk we call life is about choosing through your walk whether and how to risk brushes with death. Who has chosen to risk brushes with death? When we choose to walk in the valley of the shadow of death, who does that? Well, soldiers in the military do that. If you're a combat soldier or in a war zone, someone wants you dead. You may have to kill someone or more than one someone. There's no sin in killing in a war situation. The Bible is full of examples of righteous killing in war. That's also a subject for another day. But the difference between just and unjust killing, between murder, which the Bible forbids, and what you shall not do, and killing of necessity are two different things. But the point for today is that war places its participants in the valley of the shadow of death. Who else? Well, now all essential workers. People who work on mass transit in New York City are dying at a rate much higher than workers of mass transit in other cities, as are doctors, nurses, and retail employees. Some of these people were forbidden to wear masks early in the pandemic because it would frighten people. The Bible calls this a plague. This is the biblical word for pandemic, is a plague. And some of the people during this plague don't have the personal protective gear they need. And some, despite doing everything right, still have come down with COVID-19 and died. All are walking in the valley of the shadow of death, while many of us can stay home. So those of us who stay at home, we're in the valley of the shadow of death too, but let's say we're all in the same storm, but not in the same boat. Who else walks through the valley of the shadow of death? Well, people on missionary trips go through the valley of the shadow of death. I remember one time I was in Jamaica, and we were in a neighborhood in Kingston that was controlled by gangs. And our experience was we had to walk down the middle of the street so we wouldn't be perceived as taking sides of one gang to the other. We don't be walking down the side of the street that belongs, so to speak, to one gang or the other. We had to walk down the middle. So we literally walked a line in the developing nation between rival gangs, turfs, so that we wouldn't be seen as on the other side, which could cause someone to want to hurt us. So there we were walking through the valley of the shadow of death and doing God's work. And doing God's work is not always safe. Haiti, I was also on a missionary trip with a Jeep full of armed men in front of us, and we got out and walked, some of us into a literal valley to see a source of water that was the sole source of water before a well was installed, and we were celebrating. We were there to celebrate that well. We had armed people around us because we were in need of them. Missionaries were deemed by the population there to be rich or wealthy, had been kidnapped and even killed. The husband of a woman we know who runs an orphanage there suffered that fate. He was kidnapped and killed, even though the woman who ran the orphanage was willing to pay the ransom. They killed him anyway. And yet she stays there and she takes care of the orphans. She is choosing to walk through the valley of the shadow of death. In local social justice actions, peaceful protests, so what starts out as a peaceful protest, can have outside agitators or local rabble-rousers who don't want to see things be peaceful or stay peaceful, participate in social justice gatherings. Still, the risk is known, and those of us who choose to protest in social injustice go to march peacefully, and some protests can turn violent however they start out. The police react and sometimes overreact and sometimes do what they need to do. Just because you attract a crowd doesn't mean that they're there to help you. The crowd does not always follow. The crowd sometimes takes over and becomes a mob, becomes out of control, and people die. Yet sometimes brave men and women walk in the valley of the shadow of death in the name of social justice. What about when you feel that you have no choice? When the valley has come to you? Is walking in the valley of the shadow of death still a choice? In some homes, there's domestic violence, sexual abuse, mental illness, addiction, depression, suicidal thoughts, violence against others, deaths by overdose, and reckless behavior under the influence of alcohol. And now that we're all on lockdown, people who have home lives like that are trapped there. They shouldn't leave, they can't leave, and they're told to stay home for their safety, but they're not safe at home. As hard as it is in those situations, there's hope, and there's help, and there's a choice. The first step, as always, is to seek God, to know that it is not your fault. God did not create you to suffer, but rather to have joy and peace. The second step is to reach out and accept the help that's there. There are domestic violence shelters even now. There are child protective workers even now. There's counseling. You may have to get counseling online, but it's available. Let the social workers help you. It's what they do. Follow their advice. Sometimes medication can help us. God gave doctors and researchers wisdom to know how to help. It's okay to take medication. The Bible actually has lots of examples of people taking medication. There's no sin in taking medication. A child being abused is in the valley of the shadow of death. If you learn of such a situation, tell a professional. Especially with sexual abuse, don't tell a friend or a family member. This is the number one mistake people make when a child comes and says somebody's doing something to them, is that the instinct is to go to that somebody and confront them about that. That is exactly the wrong thing to do. You need to not talk to friends and family members about this because they're too emotionally involved. They're not equipped to handle the situation. Professionals like the police, social workers, teachers, doctors, and nurses all have training to deal with these situations appropriately. God has made a way out. So if you find a child in trouble or a child confides in you, you need to help them with professionals find the way out. Don't react however your emotions would take you to react. Consult with the professionals. If your mentally ill loved one is a danger to you or themselves, you are in the valley of the shadow of death. There are steps that can be taken, such as guardianship or involuntary commitment, even now. Many people think the courts aren't open, but that isn't true. They are open for emergencies and some other situations. So if you are in danger at home, that's the kind of emergency the courts are open for. They are still doing orders of protection. So you can reach out and get protected. Talk to a lawyer about the options. Call the courthouse and talk to them about the options. The Lord has made a way out. A person who is mentally ill or suffering from addiction can choose to get help or choose not to. If they cannot help themselves, you may be able to choose to force help upon them through a guardianship. Get them thinking clearly so they can make better choices. This is how we can help others walk through the valley. We don't let them stay in the valley. We walk, we keep moving, and we help them move. Deuteronomy 15, verses 7 through 11 says, if among you one of your brothers should become poor in any of your towns within your land that the Lord God has given you, you shall not harden your heart or shut your hand against your poor brother, but you shall open your hand to him and lend him sufficient for his need, whatever it may be. Take care lest there be an unworthy thought in your heart, and you say, the seventh year, the year of release is near, and your eye look grudgingly at your poor brother, and you give him nothing, and he cry to the Lord against you, and you be guilty of sin. You shall give to him freely, and with your heart shall not be grudging when you give to him, because it is for the Lord your God, and he will bless you in all your work and in all that you undertake. For they will never cease to be poor in the land. Therefore I command you, you shall open your hand to your brother, to the needy, to the poor in your land. Sometimes it's not just one thing that makes a valley. Sometimes it's a combination of circumstances. But if you know of anyone who is poor or hungry or needy, elderly who can't get out in this situation, see what you can do to help. Prisons can be dangerous places to be. And while the system does make mistakes, the usual circumstance is that the resident of a prison has made some choices somewhere along the line that landed them there. The inmates still walk in the valley of the shadow of death, especially now where death stalks people in crowded conditions that cannot socially distance. There are all kinds of ways people can find themselves in the valley of the shadow of death. So who else is in the valley of the shadow of death? Well, first, beloved, we all are. Sometimes it's more evident than other times. Sometimes we choose to walk through the valley of the shadow of death for good reasons. Sometimes not. Sometimes the devil leads us into the valley of the shadow of death through temptations. The devil is always in the valley of the shadow of death. No matter how you or a loved one gets into the valley of the shadow of death, rest assured Satan is there. Whether the Lord allowed the valley to teach us or bring us something, or we marched into the valley following the devil in sin, the devil always tries to take advantage of our circumstances. Ever since the Garden of Eden, the devil has taken advantage of circumstances to convince God's greatest creation that disobeying the will of God is a good thing. Disobeying the will of God is never a good thing. When you walk through the valley of the shadow of death, the devil will be there trying to make it worse. It's his job. So you will find the devil in the valley of the shadow of death. Who else besides you and the devil are in the valley? Well, the Bible says, for thou art with me. Who is thou? God, of course. God does not promise there will be no valleys. God promises to be there with you in the valley. What happens when God is with us? Well, it says, no weapons formed against us will prosper in Isaiah 54:7. It says, he will bear our burdens in Exodus 6:6-7. It says, he will work it out for our good in Romans 8:28. Then who should be afraid? Should we be afraid? No. Indeed, we're not to be fearful in the valley. I shall fear no evil. That means even though evil comes into our lives, we shouldn't be afraid of it. Should anyone be afraid in the valley? And if so, who should be afraid? And what should they be afraid of? If God is with you, and no one can be against you, and no weapon formed against you shall prosper, then the devil should be afraid of you, because God is with you. When you are in that valley, you tell the devil and his demons and the evil that you find, get thee behind me, Satan. If you are a born-again child of the living God, you have the power to cast out devils in Jesus' name. That's in Mark 16:17. Does that mean we're all going to be exorcists? No, it doesn't. But it does give you the power to triumph over evil in your own life, to face it, to deal with it, and to know that God is with you and that God is enough. Amen? Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Some preachers will talk about God as if he is Santa Claus. They take verses like, when two or three or more are gathered in his name, or what you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and tell people that this means if they only believe hard enough and pray, their prayers will be answered in the way they hope and dream that they'll be answered. Or maybe in even a bigger, better way than they dare to dream. Sometimes that happens. We know God has a plan for our lives, but nowhere in the Bible does it promise us a life without tragedy, without problems, or a no answer to our prayers. Don't miss that. God always answers prayers. Sometimes the answer is no. Don't keep chasing after what God is trying to save you from, what he's trying to keep you from. How does the walk in the valley look from a Christian perspective? What Christians have problems that we can look at and think about? First, let's remind ourselves that Mary, the mother of Jesus, was told that she was blessed among women. This person, who was pure and blessed among women, watched her son die when he was in the prime of his physical life. And after Jesus died, having no husband, history does not record what happened to Joseph after he and Mary lost Jesus for 3 days when he was 12. Mary had to depend on one of her son's disciples to care for her. The disciples had rough lives, and we know what happened to Paul. We do not deserve better than them. We do not deserve anything. So if you think you have problems, and you do, remember that the most blessed woman in history watched her son die and was left poor. She walked in the valley of shadow of death, yet God was with her, and she was in fact taken care of. She was not forsaken or left alone, but she didn't die rich that we know of. The second thing to notice in that verse is that we're to keep moving through the valley. The Bible talks about walking through the valley. We're not to sit in the valley. We're not to rest in the valley. We're not to make friends with the valley. We're not to get comfortable in the valley. We're not to stop and weep in the valley. We're not to look for an apartment in the valley and live there. We are to use sustained effort to go through. We don't set up camp in the valley. We don't get distracted and tarry there. We walk through the valley. Like Dory and Nemo, we just keep swimming. Sometimes it's not helpful to take it one day at a time, as we're often advised to do. Sometimes we have to take it one moment at a time. In the greatest crises in our lives, sometimes people say, slow down, breathe. And sometimes people are insulted by that. Well, what does that mean? It means to take one moment at a time. Breathe in, breathe out. Focus on the breath going in and coming out. Do it again. You can make it to the next moment and the next. And soon, moments turn into the next day, and you keep busy. And the outcome is the path is through the valley of the shadow of death. And eventually, we're expected to come out on the other side. We're not to stay in the valley. It's not our destiny to dwell in the valley. The Lord has plans for our lives. And may almost certainly, if we live long enough, if we don't die in infancy, there's going to be problems and tragedies in our lives. We are in an unusual experience in the pandemic, in that everyone all over the globe is in the same crisis. Everyone all over the globe, with very few exceptions in some countries or cities, we're all shut down. There's 4 billion people locked down, except those who are considered essential workers. This is not a surprise to God. Regular attenders of Shiloh Community Church and most churches know that God is not in his heaven scratching his head, wondering how this happens. He has a plan. There are many examples of biblical plagues. None of this is beyond God's power to deal with. The next thing to notice is that there will be a valley. The admonition that I will fear no evil means that there will be evil around us and we will face evil. However, we should not fear it. Why? Because he that is in us is greater than he that is of the evil. Evil people and things should fear those walking through the valley of the shadow of death, because when you walk with God in your daily life, even walking in the valley of the shadow of death, you walk with God. Think of Daniel in the lion's den, or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the furnace. Jesus having supper with Judas, knowing he was soon to be betrayed by Judas. He still had supper with him. He still had communion with him. This led to Jesus' triumph on the cross. It had to happen. Jonah was swallowed by a great fish. Mary and Joseph had to flee to Egypt with their infant son Jesus because Herod was killing babies. There's evil all around us and always has been, but God can make a way out for you. Sometimes the truth is the main evil we have to face in our valley is the evil within ourselves, the evil within our own hearts, the evil that wants to blame and take revenge, the evil that does not want us to forgive, the evil that wants to doubt God because his ways are not our ways, because he allows things to happen that we don't like. We're always our own biggest challenge, aren't we? Evil in the valley because we are in the valley, and the hearts of people harbor evil, even while we also harbor good. It's a battle. So make no mistake, if we're in the valley, notwithstanding the external evil that's in the valley, we carry the evil in our hearts in the valley. We have evil in our hearts. We have good in our hearts, but we also have evil in our hearts. We think unkind thoughts. We don't want to forgive. We want to blame other people for our problems. We want to blame God. We want to be angry with God. We want to be angry with other people. We want to say how it's someone else's fault instead of taking responsibility. Now, this pandemic may or may not have been caused by artificial means. The scientists tell us it's a natural pandemic. It may or may not have been made worse by things that Chinese authorities let out or didn't let out. But that is really besides the point. The fact is, here we are. Here we are in this pandemic, in this evil together. Although, as I said, we're in different boats. Some of us are in boats that have to sail out to work every day and face the public and face a much higher chance of possible infection. Some of us are in tiny apartments. Some of us are in big houses with plenty. We're not all in the same boat. The social media with the celebrities, showing how they're handling the pandemic is very, very different reality from people who didn't have enough to begin with. And we need to be mindful of that. So David, the anointed king, was being pursued by Saul. He had been anointed king, but the current king was trying to kill him. God was with him. God was with Moses in the desert and delivered manna, but not a grateful people. God is with the doctors in the hospitals and the lawyers in the courtroom. He didn't promise us, God. He didn't promise us we'll never need a doctor or a lawyer. He doesn't promise us the outcomes we want. He promises us that he'll be with us to comfort us. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Why should I be comforted by sticks? God is a just, fair God, and although we do not always like when he chastens us, it's an indication that those who would harm us in the valley are facing the chastening of God also for doing so. We should be comforted that God has tools to defend us. He will prepare a table for me in the presence of mine enemies. So when we get out of the valley, and we will, we can have comfort in the fact that vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. God does not promise you will have no enemies. He promises to make you a table in front of them. Your enemies will see you do well if you live for and trust God. So trust God in the valley. The God of the valley is the God of the mountains. When you're in the valley, you'll come through. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. God tells us that goodness and mercy shall follow us, not always lead us, but it will follow all the days of our lives, which are numbered. None of us gets out of this alive. God does not promise us that we won't die or that no one we love will die. In fact, we all die. All of us, everyone we love, everyone we know, everyone we care about will die. Then what happens? Well, we'll dwell in the house of the Lord forever. This life is really just a small moment in eternity. If you think about eternity, there's the song I sang at the beginning, Amazing Grace. And it says in one of the verses, when we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. Think about it, 10,000 years and you haven't lost a minute because eternity is forever. So as we walk together and with God through the valley, don't be afraid. Use this time at home wisely. If you're at home, if you're an essential worker, may God bless you and keep you as you do what needs to be done. We'll get through this to the other side. The world is likely to be a different place, but it will still be God's place. It will still be God's creation. And you still have a place in that creation. You still have work to do in that creation. He still has a plan for your life until he calls you home. Whether it's sooner or later is up to him. Our job is just to keep going, keep doing what's right, keep serving him by serving others. That's what we need to do. So as we walk through the valley of the shadow of death, don't forget that God is with us. You can talk to him anytime. You can pray anytime. He's with you. God and prayer is the best Wi-Fi system in the world. It's never out. It never goes down. So while we're walking through the valley of the shadow of death, remember that we don't have to fear evil. That God is with us. God is in us. We have the Holy Spirit in our hearts. And that we can prevail and triumph over evil, any evil, whether it's a virus or whether it's any other kind of evil that there is. But that doesn't mean we're going to have the outcomes that we want. It doesn't mean that when we pray for something, God is some sort of Santa Claus or genie who's just going to give us what we want if we really believe and pray real hard. God has a plan, and sometimes that plan is to end a life sooner than we would like it to end. But if that person is a child of God, if they're a person of the book, if they're a child of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we'll see them on the other side in eternity. And we can know that and have that hope. Unlike people who don't believe in any kind of a faith, we don't have that hope. We'll be together on the other side. But in the meantime, our focus needs to be on helping each other and doing the Lord's work and worshiping him. Amen? Lord, thank you for this opportunity to be together today. Thank you for the ability to share your word with your people in this time of crisis, Lord. If this happened 100 years ago, people would be without their churches and their ability to gather together and staying home and just being able to converse with people who are right there with them. But now we can converse with other people through technology. We can gather together through technology. And Lord, we praise you for the work that you're doing and for the people that are coming home to you, Lord, the people that are understanding that they cannot live without a God that created them and that they need to turn their hearts towards you in this difficult time. And then when we come through the difficult time, to keep their hearts towards you, Lord, and to keep working with you together in your perfect plan for our lives and our world, Lord. Because if we all did that, there would be certain kinds of suffering that would be gone. There would be no war. There would be no poverty, because we would love each other and take care of each other and be one another's keeper, Lord. And I pray for that time, Lord. And I thank you for the opportunity to have your word, to study your word, to be with you and these your people. I ask that you bless everyone who's listening, Lord, within the sound of my voice, that you bless them, you bless their families, that you build a hedge around them and keep harm far from them, Lord. In Jesus' name, I pray all of these things. Amen. Amen. See you next week, beloved.